For some serial killers, the notoriety of their crimes was never enough. They craved more attention, more control, more of the spotlight. And what better stage than a courtroom packed with jurors, reporters, and the public? By representing themselves at trial, these killers didn't fight for their lives, but risked it to a great degree. From H. Holmes in the 1800s to Ted Bundy and Rodney Alcala, all the way to modern-day killers like John Allen Muhammad and Joshua Dotson. These are the chilling stories of when murderers decided to become their own lawyers. Welcome back to Prison Stories. In this episode, we'll look at some serial killers in history and modern times who chose to represent themselves in court. We'll explore whether it was a bold move or a fatal mistake. H. Holmes. Herman Webster Mudgett, better known as H. Holmes, stood trial in Philadelphia in October 1895 for the murder of his accomplice, Benjamin Pitezel. Unlike most defendants, Holmes refused his court-appointed lawyers and declared that he would represent himself. The judge granted his request, affirming that it was his constitutional right. Holmes carried himself with an unsettling calm in the courtroom. He cross-examined jurors, questioned witnesses, and even tried to use his supposed medical expertise to challenge the prosecution's forensic evidence. At one point, he demanded scientific tests be carried out on the substances he was accused of using, insisting that he was qualified to interpret them. But his composure often slipped into arrogance. After a gruesome description of Pitezel's corpse was presented in court, Holmes bizarrely requested a lunch break, leaving the jury and observers shocked at his lack of humanity. His aggressive style also failed to undermine the overwhelming case against him. Experts testified that Pitezel could not have taken his own life, as Holmes claimed, and the evidence painted a clear picture of murder. By the end of the first day, the cracks in Holmes' performance were obvious. The strain of playing lawyer began to show, and he reluctantly asked to have his attorneys reinstated. It was a quiet admission of defeat from a man who had always thrived on control. In the end, Holmes' gamble gained him publicity but cost him credibility. He was convicted of first-degree murder and sentenced to death. On May 7, 1896, America's so-called first serial killer was hanged. His courtroom theatrics remembered as much as his crimes. Ted Bundy. Ted Bundy, one of America's most infamous serial killers, not only captivated the nation with his crimes, but also by turning his courtroom into a stage. Though court-appointed lawyers were ready, Bundy elected to represent himself during portions of his Florida trials in 1979 and 1980, a move that transformed his prosecution into a dramatic, televised spectacle. Bundy's decision stemmed from his overweening confidence. He had studied law briefly and believed he could manipulate the courtroom better than counsel. His legal team even negotiated a plea deal that would spare him the death penalty, but he rejected it, reportedly because admitting guilt in court was unthinkable for his ego. Though he waived his right to standard legal defense, Bundy wasn't alone in the courtroom. 5 lawyers were appointed as standby counsel, ready to step in if needed. Nonetheless, Bundy assumed the central role, disrupting proceedings, mocking defense strategies, and openly challenging the court's process. Judge Edward Cowart presided over Bundy's trial. He later described Bundy as one of the most intelligent, articulate, and coherent defendants I have ever seen. When sentencing Bundy to death, Cowart remarked that Bundy had the potential to be a great lawyer if he channeled his intellect differently. Bundy's courtroom presence was unsettling. He dressed sharply, walked freely without cuffs like an attorney might, and controlled the pace of the trial through calculated theatrics. Despite his eloquence, Bundy's self-representation was a strategic blunder. His theatrics did nothing to obscure the mounting forensic evidence, such as bite mark analysis and eyewitness testimony linking him to the Chi Omega House murders. His refusal to accept counsel also led to lost opportunities. like the rejected plea deal that could have spared his life. He sabotaged the entire defense effort out of spite, distrust, and grandiose delusion. The adage holds, he who represents himself has a fool for a client. Bundy was ultimately found guilty on multiple counts of first-degree murder, earning 3 death sentences. On January 24th, 1989, he was executed in Florida's electric chair. Rodney Alcala. By the time Rodney Alcala went on trial again in Orange County in early 2010, he'd already twice been convicted, and twice had those convictions overturned. In the 1979 kidnapping murder of 12-year-old Robin Samsoe. For this third go-round, prosecutors consolidated Samsoe's case with 4 Los Angeles murders from 1977 to 79 that had been newly tied to Alcala by DNA. Jill Barkham, Georgia Wixted, Charlotte Lamb, and Jill Parento. Judge Francisco Briceño warned Alcala that acting as his own lawyer was unwise, but Alcala insisted on representing himself. Once in charge of his own defense, Alcala delivered an opening focused almost entirely on Samsoe, projecting a slide titled The 6-minute 15-second Window of Opportunity, and promising to prove he was at Knott's Berry Farm applying for a photography job when the girl disappeared. Coverage from the courtroom described her performance as oscillating between tentative, odd, and occasionally competent, often requiring guidance from the judge on basic procedure. His cross-examinations became the trial's most jarring feature. Alcala personally grilled witnesses, including Samsoe's mother, pressing her about a pair of gold ball earrings the prosecution said were hers and were found in Alcala's locker. The exchange grew heated enough that the jury was excused. He later argued the earrings were his, partly by invoking his ear-piercing history and by playing a clip from his 1978 appearance on The Dating Game to suggest he wore similar jewelry. Alcala also questioned surviving victim Tali Shapiro from a 1968 attack for which he'd long ago been convicted, who returned to testify as an adult in the penalty phase. He even apologized to her from counsel table, an extraordinary moment given he was both defendant and attorney. At one point, Alcala literally questioned himself on the stand. In a deeper voice, he'd ask Mr. Alcala questions, then answer in his normal voice, a surreal self-interrogation that underscored how unorthodox and risky his pro-se strategy had become. He kept repeating his Knott's Berry Farm alibi and downplayed or ignored much of the DNA evidence in the 4 Los Angeles murders. The jury was unmoved. On February 25, 2010, they convicted Alcala of 5 counts of first-degree murder, along with special circumstance findings, multiple murder, kidnapping, rape, torture, that made him eligible for death. On March 9th, they recommended the death penalty. Judge Briceño later imposed a sentence. Reporters noted that, during the penalty phase, Alcala told jurors a death sentence would only lead to years of appeals. Then, in a final flourish, played a portion of Arlo Guthrie's Alice's Restaurant as part of his plea for life. The theatrics didn't help. He was condemned to death in 2010 and remained on California's death row until he died of natural causes in 2021. Alcala's self-representation let him control the narrative, confront his witnesses, and perform for the jury, but it also amplified the bizarre, manipulative traits the prosecution said defined him. With 5 guilty verdicts and a death sentence, his pro-se gamble clearly failed. John Allen Muhammad. In a chilling twist during his 2003 Virginia capital murder trial for the D.C. sniper attacks, John Allen Muhammad stunned the courtroom by firing his legal team and opting to represent himself just moments before opening statements began. Judge Leroy F. Millett Jr. expressed disbelief at Muhammad's decision, reminding him that his attorneys had decades of experience, while he had none. But Muhammad was adamant. The courtroom braces Muhammad delivered a 20-minute, meandering plea. He quoted scripture invoking religious tones, metaphors, and even a story about his daughter eating cookies to cast doubt on the prosecution's case. Witnessing jurors and lawyers alike were left unsettled. Muhammad attempted to cross-examine witnesses himself, like a British Army sniper expert, but fumbled through questioning. He even pounded at the lectern to appear authoritative, though his inexperience was painfully obvious. Observers likened the scene to a circus. Just 2 days into his solo defense, under pressure from courtroom chaos and suffering from a toothache, Muhammad dropped the act. He conceded that self-representation was not in his best interest and reinstated his attorneys, Peter Greenspun and Jonathan Shapiro. They shifted back to the act of defense, and the trial resumed under more traditional representation. After reverting to professional defense, Muhammad was convicted on all counts, including capital murder, conspiracy, and terrorism-related charges, and sentenced to death in Virginia. In 2006, a separate Maryland trial resulted in additional life sentences. He was executed by lethal injection on November 10, 2009. Joshua Dotson. In a chilling modern echo of courtroom theatrics, Joshua Dotson, a self-proclaimed serial killer from Memphis, decided to represent himself in court during the trial for the murder of his pregnant ex-girlfriend, Jamisha Kovson, and her unborn child in mid-2024. The move startled everyone in the courtroom. During his testimony, Dotson openly referred to himself as a serial killer and even compared himself to Michael Myers, the notorious slasher from the Halloween films. Dotson's self-representation wasn't just shocking, it was brazen. He testified that Kovson had been a sex worker and implied she was killed because she was aware of his other murders. This bizarre stance didn't end there. After being convicted in August 2024, receiving 2 consecutive 51-year sentences, 102 years total, for the murders, Dotson continued to own the courtroom aura of infamy. Dotson's trial and his public confession did not end there. In February 2025, he pled guilty to 3 additional murders: Devian Parker, Renita Bennett, and Reginald Anderson, along with charges of reckless endangerment. This resulted in an additional 159-year sentence, bringing his total to a staggering 261 years in prison. Again, he openly referred to himself as a serial killer and invoked his Michael Myers persona. And there you have it. 5 serial killers who thought they could outsmart the justice system by representing themselves. From the twisted confidence of H.H. Holmes to the showmanship of Ted Bundy, the bizarre arrogance of Rodney Alcala, and the chilling defiance of John Allen Muhammad and Daryl Keith Dotson. Each believed they could control their fate in court, but in the end, their self-representation only added to their infamy, and justice caught up with them all. Thank you for watching Prison Stories. If you found this episode interesting, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into the darkest corners of crime history.